November 24th, 1944, 3:47 a.m. Formosa Strait, 127 feet below the surface. The sonar operator's hands were trembling. His headphones pressed tight against his ears. He leaned forward, eyes wide with terror, and whispered the words that would change everything. They're right above us. 73 men held their breath in the suffocating darkness of USS Barracuda. The temperature inside the submarine had climbed to 114 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat dripped from their faces, pooling on the deck plates beneath their feet. The air was so thick with carbon dioxide that some men had already passed out. And directly above them, 4 Japanese destroyers circled like sharks who had cornered their prey. Commander Thomas Iron Tom Caldwell stood at the center of the control room, his weathered face betraying nothing. Every man watched him, waiting. The next order he gave would determine whether they lived or died. He turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, and spoke 3 words that made the entire crew go pale. Prepare to surface. Hayes grabbed Caldwell's arm. Sir, that's suicide. They'll cut us to pieces before we clear the hatch. Caldwell's eyes never wavered. Then we'll die fighting, not suffocating in our own tomb. But what neither of them knew, what none of them could possibly know, was that the decision to surface wasn't Caldwell's to make anymore. Because in exactly 17 minutes, the Japanese weren't going to be their biggest problem. If you're new here and you love stories of courage, survival, and impossible odds, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. And if this story grips you the way it gripped me when I first discovered it, smash that like button. It helps more people find these incredible true stories. Now, to understand how 73 American sailors ended up trapped 127 feet underwater, with death circling above them, we need to go back 6 days. Back to when Commander Caldwell received orders that would send his submarine into the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. November 18th, 1944, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The USS Barracuda had just completed a 2-week refit. New torpedoes, fresh supplies. A crew that had been given shore leave for the first time in 4 months. Morale was high. Commander Caldwell sat in the submarine tender's wardroom, reading his orders for the 3rd time. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The orders were simple. Proceed to the Formosa Strait. Intercept and destroy Japanese supply convoys transporting troops and equipment to reinforce the Philippines. Report all contacts. Take no unnecessary risks. It was that last line that made Caldwell's jaw tighten. Take no unnecessary risks. Whoever wrote that had never been inside a submarine. In submarine warfare, everything was a risk. Every dive, every torpedo, every breath. But there was something else in the orders that troubled him even more. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had significantly increased their anti-submarine patrols in the Formosa Strait. They had developed new tactics, new weapons. And they were getting better at finding American submarines. Much better. In the past 3 months alone, 6 American submarines had been lost in the Pacific. USS Shark, USS Tang, USS Scholar, USS Albacore, USS Growler, USS Scamp. Over 400 men gone. Some sunk by depth charges, others by mines. A few, the most tragic of all, by mechanical failures that sent them spiraling into the crushing depths, never to be seen again. Caldwell folded the orders and slipped them into his pocket. He had commanded submarines for 11 years. He had survived depth charge attacks that had literally knocked him off his feet. He had watched the hull flex and groan under pressures that should have crushed them like a tin can, but he had never lost a single man. And he wasn't about to start now. What Caldwell didn't know, what no one at Pearl Harbor knew, was that Japanese codebreakers had intercepted fragments of American naval communications. They knew a submarine would be entering the Formosa Strait. They didn't know which one. They didn't know exactly when. But they knew enough. And they were waiting. November 20th, 1944. 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor. The USS Barracuda cut through the Pacific swells at 18 knots, running on the surface under the cover of darkness. During World War II, American submarines typically traveled on the surface at night. The diesel engines could breathe, the batteries could charge, and the radar could scan for threats up to 15 miles away. Below decks, the crew settled into the grinding routine of submarine life. 8 hours on watch, 8 hours of maintenance and training, 8 hours of rest, though rest was a generous term for trying to sleep in a narrow bunk while the boat rolled through 10-foot swells. The submarine was 311 feet long and 27 feet wide at its broadest point. Into that space, the Navy had crammed 73 men, 24 torpedoes, 2 diesel engines, 4 electric motors, enough fuel for 75 days at sea, and enough food to feed a small village. Privacy didn't exist. The officers' quarters were separated from the enlisted men's bunks by a thin curtain. The only head, the Navy term for toilet, that worked reliably was in the forward torpedo room, which meant walking past sleeping men and stacked torpedoes just to relieve yourself, and the smell. Nothing in the world smelled like a submarine on patrol. Diesel fuel, sweat, cooking grease, and something else. Something men who served on submarines recognized but never talked about. The smell of 73 men facing the constant possibility of death. Radio man first class, Danny Martinez sat in the cramped radio shack, copying the evening traffic from Pearl Harbor. Routine messages mostly, weather reports, position updates from other submarines in the area. Then came the message that made his blood run cold. He decoded it twice, certain he had made a mistake. Then he grabbed the paper and ran to the control room. Captain needs to see this immediately. Commander Caldwell read the message, his expression unchanging, but Martinez noticed something he had never seen before in 11 months of serving under Caldwell. The captain's hand was shaking. "Clear the control room," Caldwell said quietly. "Officers only." When the enlisted men had filed out, Caldwell handed the message to his executive officer. Lieutenant Commander Peter Hayes read it aloud. USS Salmon reported under attack Formosa Strait. Position 2024 defined bin N 120 to 45 E. Heavy depth charging. No further communications. Presumed lost. The Salmon had been on the same patrol route as the Barracuda. She had entered the Formosa Strait, just 48 hours ahead of them. "That's less than 200 miles from our planned entry point," Hayes said. Caldwell nodded slowly. "The Japanese know we're coming." But here's what neither Caldwell nor anyone else in the American submarine fleet understood at the time. The Japanese hadn't just gotten lucky. They had fundamentally changed their anti-submarine warfare tactics. For the first 3 years of the Pacific War, Japanese destroyers had depth-charged with a scatter pattern, dropping explosives in a wide area, hoping to catch the submarine somewhere in the blast radius. It was effective, but inefficient. But by late 1944, they had developed something new, something terrifying. They called it the San-Shiki attack pattern, the Type 3 method. Instead of dropping depth charges randomly, they used coordinated teams of destroyers equipped with the latest sonar technology, purchased from Nazi Germany through submarine trade routes. 4 ships would position themselves at the corners of a square, each pinging with active sonar, triangulating the exact position and depth of their target. Then they would attack in sequence, dropping charges in a precise pattern that left no avenue of escape. The method had one devastating requirement. The submarine had to stay quiet long enough for the destroyers to fix its position, and American submarines, with their noisy cooling pumps and rattling auxiliary machinery, were extraordinarily difficult to keep silent. The USS Barracuda was about to sail directly into a trap designed specifically to exploit that weakness. November 22nd, 1944. Entrance to the Formosa Strait. The submarine submerged at dawn, settling to 150 feet, deep enough to avoid visual detection from aircraft, but shallow enough to maintain good sonar reception. The crew shifted to ultra-quiet running, speaking in whispers, walking in soft-soled shoes, avoiding any unnecessary movement. Sonar operator Petty Officer 2nd Class William Chen sat at his station, eyes closed, concentrating entirely on the sounds flowing through his headphones. Chen was 22 years old. He had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who had fled China in 1925. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. In 2 years of submarine service, Chen had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify and classify sounds underwater. He could tell the difference between a Japanese destroyer and a patrol craft by the rhythm of their propellers. He could detect a distant convoy by the subtle harmonics of cargo ships riding heavy in the water. And right now, he was hearing something that made absolutely no sense. "Captain to sonar," he said quietly into the intercom. Caldwell appeared at his shoulder within seconds. "What do you have, Chen?" "I'm not sure, sir. Bearing 045, maybe 8,000 yards. It sounds like nothing." "Nothing?" "That's the problem, Captain. There's a hole in the ambient noise, like something is sitting there, dead quiet, waiting." Caldwell frowned. In submarine warfare, silence was usually good. Enemy ships made noise. Propellers, engines, pumps. A quiet patch of ocean meant safety. Unless... Could it be another submarine? Chen shook his head slowly. "If it was a submarine, I'd hear something. Cooling pumps, auxiliary machinery, but this is different. It's like the ocean itself is holding its breath." Caldwell felt ice form in his stomach. He had heard stories from other commanders, rumors really, about Japanese destroyers that would shut down their engines and drift silently, waiting for American submarines to come to them. "I'll stop," he ordered quietly. "Rig for silent running." The Barracuda's propellers went still. The auxiliary systems dropped to minimal power. 73 men barely breathed, and in the silence, Chen heard it. A single ping, high-pitched, mechanical, coming from bearing 045, then another from 315, then 2 more from 135 and 225. 4 pings, 4 directions, a perfect square. "Destroyers," Chen whispered. 4 of them. They've got us boxed in, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. The pings continued, every 15 seconds, growing stronger, more precise. They weren't searching anymore, they had already found the Barracuda. Commander Caldwell had exactly 90 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his crew lived or died. He had 3 options. Option 1, run. Go to flank speed and try to escape the sonar trap before the destroyers could coordinate their attack. The Barracuda could make 20 knots submerged, fast for a submarine but painfully slow compared to the 35-knot destroyers above. Running would also generate enough noise to give the Japanese a perfect firing solution. Option 2, go deep. The Formosa Strait had depths exceeding 1,500 feet in some areas. If Caldwell could find a thermal layer, a boundary between warm and cold water that could deflect sonar signals, he might be able to hide. But finding a thermal layer was pure luck, and the deeper they went, the greater the risk that the hull would simply collapse under the pressure. Option 3, fight. Surface and attack with the deck gun and torpedoes before the destroyers could react. It was suicide against 4 warships, but at least they would go down fighting. Caldwell chose none of them. Instead, he made a decision that went against every instinct, every piece of training, everything he had learned in 11 years of submarine command. "I'll stop," he ordered. "Flood negative tank to neutral buoyancy, and someone get me the chief of the boat." The crew exchanged confused glances. Stopping was the worst possible choice. A stationary submarine was a dead submarine. Chief of the boatmaster? Chief Samuel Washington appeared at Caldwell's side. Washington was 51 years old, the oldest man aboard, and he had served on submarines since 1919. There wasn't a situation he hadn't seen, a problem he couldn't fix. "Sam," Caldwell said quietly, so only Washington could hear, "how long can we stay at this depth without running the air scrubbers?" Washington's face went pale. The air scrubbers, the machines that removed carbon dioxide from the submarine's atmosphere, ran on electricity. And electricity meant noise. Noise that the Japanese sonar would pick up immediately. Without scrubbers, maybe 4 hours before CO2 levels become dangerous. 6 hours before men start passing out. 8 to 10 hours before... He didn't finish the sentence. "And the destroyers?" Washington considered. "They can't stay out here forever. They're burning fuel every minute, but they can probably outlast us." "Sir, what are you thinking?" Caldwell smiled grimly. "I'm thinking that those destroyers expect us to run. That's what their fancy new tactics are designed for. Catching a submarine that tries to escape. So we're not going to run. We're going to sit here? We're going to sit here, Sam. Perfectly still. Perfectly quiet. We're going to become a hole in the ocean. And we're going to wait for them to get bored and leave." It was an insane plan. It required 73 men to remain absolutely motionless and silent for hours, while 4 enemy warships circled above them. It required the submarine to become a floating coffin, conserving every molecule of oxygen while the air slowly turned poisonous. But it also relied on one crucial piece of psychology that Caldwell understood about the Japanese destroyer captains. They were hunters, and hunters expected their prey to flee. The waiting began. The first hour was the hardest. Every 30 seconds, another sonar ping would echo through the hull. The crew flinched each time, expecting the thunder of depth charges, but none came. The Japanese were confused. Their sonar told them a submarine was there. The initial pings had clearly detected the Barracuda's hull. But now, with the submarine running completely silent, they couldn't pinpoint its exact location or depth. And without a precise fix, dropping depth charges was useless. The charges had to explode within 20 feet of a submarine's hull to cause fatal damage. A 50-foot miss might shake some equipment loose. A 100-foot miss was nothing but noise. Commander Caldwell moved silently through the submarine, checking on his crew. In the forward torpedo room, 6 men lay in their bunks, conserving oxygen. In the engine room, the diesel mechanics sat motionless beside machines that had been their whole world for months. In the conning tower, the officer of the deck stared at instruments that had gone dark. And in the radio shack, Radioman Martinez was doing something that could get them all killed. He was sending a message. Caldwell grabbed Martinez's shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Martinez held up his hand, finishing a string of Morse code so faint that even the radio receiver could barely pick it up. Then he turned to face the captain. "Sir, I modified the transmitter. Minimum power. Directional antenna aimed at the ocean floor. The signal bounces off the bottom and scatters. Even if the Japanese pick it up, they won't be able to locate the source." "And who are you transmitting to?" Martinez swallowed. "The salmon, sir. If there's any chance they're still alive, hiding like we are, they need to know they're not alone." For a long moment, Caldwell stared at the young radio man. What Martinez had done was incredibly risky, but it was also incredibly brave. "Did you get a response?" "Nothing yet, sir, but I'll keep trying." Caldwell nodded slowly. "If you get us killed with that radio, I'll haunt you for eternity." "Understood, sir." The second hour brought the first crisis. Torpedo Man's mate. Third class Jimmy O'Brien had been struggling with claustrophobia for weeks. He had managed to hide it. Submarine sailors couldn't afford to show weakness, but the silent running finally broke him. In the after torpedo room, O'Brien suddenly stood up and started screaming. "We're going to die down here! We're going to die! We have to get out! We have to get out!" 3 men tackled him before he could reach the escape hatch. They held him down while the ship's pharmacist mate, a soft-spoken man from Georgia named Henderson, injected him with enough sedative to drop a horse. But the damage was done. Above them, the sonar pings increased in frequency. The destroyers had heard something. Commander Caldwell's voice came over the intercom, barely above a whisper. "All hands. Complete silence. No movement. No sound. Our lives depend on the next 5 minutes." The submarine became a tomb. Men who had been sitting upright slowly lowered themselves to the deck, reducing even the sound of their breathing. Some closed their eyes and prayed. Chen, at the sonar station, tracked the destroyers' movements. They were repositioning, tightening their formation, centering on the location of O'Brien's screams. Then the first depth charge exploded. The shockwave hit the Barracuda like a giant's fist. Men were thrown from their bunks. Equipment crashed from shelves. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat, plunging entire compartments into darkness. But the explosion was at least 100 feet away. The hull held. A second charge detonated. Closer this time, maybe 70 feet. The pressure hull groaned in protest. Somewhere in the engine room, a pipe burst, sending a jet of water spraying across the compartment. "Damage control to engine room!" someone shouted before remembering they were supposed to be silent. The third charge exploded directly above them. The Barracuda rolled 40 degrees to port. Loose gear became deadly projectiles. A rating in the control room was knocked unconscious by a flying fire extinguisher. The depth gauge needle spun wildly as the submarine dropped uncontrollably toward the bottom. "Blow emergency ballast," Caldwell ordered. "Sir, they'll hear—" "Blow it!" The ballast tanks erupted with compressed air, arresting the submarine's descent at 340 feet, just 60 feet above the maximum safe diving depth. Any deeper, and the pressure would have started buckling the hull plates. But the noise had confirmed their position to the destroyers. And now the real attack began. For the next 47 minutes, the Japanese destroyers dropped 89 depth charges on and around the USS Barracuda. The assault was methodical, precise, devastating. The destroyers would ping, fix the submarine's position, then drop a pattern of charges set to explode at varying depths. Before the Barracuda could recover from one attack, the next was already beginning. At 3:12 a.m., the main lighting circuits failed permanently. The boat went dark except for emergency battle lanterns that cast a dim red glow. At 3:28 a.m., a seam in the forward torpedo room split open, allowing seawater to pour in at a rate of 50 gallons per minute. A repair team worked frantically in the dark, stuffing mattresses and rags into the gap, while freezing water rose around their ankles. At 3:35 a.m., the hull registered a near miss that bent the periscope housing 15 degrees off center. Even if they survived, the Barracuda would be fighting blind. At 3:47 a.m., sonar operator Chen made the announcement that shattered whatever hope remained. "They're right above us," he whispered. All 4 destroyers. Dead slow, directly overhead. This was the final positioning. The Japanese had fixed the Barracuda's exact location and depth. They were preparing for a coordinated drop, all 4 ships releasing depth charges simultaneously, creating a sphere of destruction that no submarine could survive. Commander Caldwell looked around the control room. At Hayes, his executive officer, who had served with him for 3 years. At Washington, the chief of the boat, who had mentored 2 generations of submarine sailors. At the young helmsman, barely 20, who was holding his course with trembling hands. These men trusted him. They had followed him into the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. And now he was out of options. Or was he? Caldwell walked to the chart table and studied the depth soundings of the Formosa Strait. They were in deep water, over 600 feet to the bottom, but 3 miles to the east, the seafloor rose sharply. A submarine shelf jutted out at approximately 350 feet. If he could reach that shelf... "Helm," Caldwell said quietly. "Come left to zone 90, ahead 1/3. Hayes grabbed his arm. "Sir, if we move, they'll have an exact track on us." "They already have an exact track on us. In about 30 seconds, they're going to drop everything they have. Our only chance is to not be here when it arrives. The batteries are at 12%. I know, but it's either move or die." The Barracuda's propellers began to turn slowly, as quietly as physically possible. The submarine crept eastward at 3 knots, barely faster than a man could walk. Above them, the destroyers detected the movement immediately. Their sonar pings became frantic, tracking the submarine's course. Then the depth charges started falling, but Caldwell had bought them one crucial advantage: distance. The charges the destroyers had prepared were set to explode at the Barracuda's previous depth and position. By the time they detonated, the submarine had moved 200 yards. The explosions rocked the boat but didn't destroy it. "More speed," Caldwell ordered. "Ahead, 2/3. "Sir, the noise doesn't matter anymore. They know exactly where we are. All that matters now is reaching that shelf." The submarine accelerated to 8 knots. Every man aboard could hear the propellers cavitating, creating tiny bubbles that collapsed with audible pops, a sound that sonar operators called water singing. It was like ringing a dinner bell for the destroyers. But Caldwell wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was racing for shelter. The depth charges came faster now, a continuous rain of explosions that illuminated the dark water with orange-white flashes. The concussions merged into one continuous thunder. The hull flexed visibly with each blast, rivets straining against pressures they were never designed to withstand. At 4:12 a.m., the Barracuda reached the shelf. "Emergency dive," Caldwell commanded. "Take us down to 400 feet and hold us against the cliff face." It was an almost impossible maneuver. The submarine had to descend rapidly while simultaneously approaching a nearly vertical wall of rock. One mistake, too fast, wrong angle, miscalculated depth, and they would simply crash into the seafloor. But the diving officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Erickson, was the best in the Pacific Fleet. His hands moved across the ballast controls with the precision of a concert pianist. He adjusted trim, monitored the depth gauge, and watched the seafloor approach through the boat's primitive fathometer. At 4:14 a.m., the USS Barracuda settled against the cliff face at 397 feet. The crew waited, breathless, for the destroyers to find them. But something strange was happening on the surface. The sonar pings continued, but they were becoming confused, scattering. The cliff face was reflecting the sound waves in unexpected ways, creating multiple echoes that made it impossible to fix the submarine's position. "They've lost us," Chen reported, unable to keep the amazement out of his voice. "The echoes from the shelf are confusing their sonar. They can't tell us apart from the rock. For the first time in hours, Commander Caldwell allowed himself to breathe, but they weren't safe, not even close. The destroyers were still there, still circling. And inside the Barracuda, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The air was running out. Without the scrubbers running, carbon dioxide was building up faster than anyone had predicted. Men began experiencing the first symptoms of hypercapnia. Headaches, confusion, difficulty thinking. Some were already losing consciousness. The temperature had climbed to 114 degrees as the boat sat motionless, absorbing heat from the compressed bodies and equipment with no way to dissipate it. Men stripped to their underwear, then stripped completely, desperate for any relief from the suffocating heat. And the forward torpedo room was still flooding. The repair team had managed to slow the leak but couldn't stop it entirely. By Caldwell's calculation, they had perhaps 6 more hours before the weight of the incoming water would drag them off the shelf and send them plunging to a depth the hull couldn't survive. "We have to surface," Hayes said quietly. He and Caldwell had retreated to the tiny captain's stateroom for a private conference. "It's the only way. If we surface, they'll destroy us in minutes. If we stay down here, we'll die anyway. CO2 poisoning, flooding, or heat stroke. Take your pick." Caldwell rubbed his eyes. His vision was starting to blur, a symptom of the carbon dioxide building up in his bloodstream. "How long until dawn?" 2 hours, maybe less. "And the destroyers? Still circling?" But Chen thinks they might be getting ready to give up. They haven't dropped any charges in over an hour. They probably think we're dead. Caldwell considered this. The Japanese commanders were experienced. They would know that no submarine could survive the punishment that Barracuda had taken. From their perspective, the American boat was almost certainly at the bottom, crushed or flooded. But to be certain, they would stay until dawn, until they could search the surface for debris, oil slicks, bodies, the telltale signs of a submarine kill. That gave Caldwell an idea. "Get me the chief of the boat," he said, "and tell the torpedo room to prepare tubes 1 through 4. Hayes stared at him. "Sir, we're not in any condition to attack. We're not going to attack. We're going to die." For the next 30 minutes, the crew of the USS Barracuda worked in complete silence, preparing the most unconventional operation of the Pacific War. From the garbage storage compartment, men retrieved bags of food scraps, oil-soaked rags, and empty containers. These were sealed in canvas bags, along with a carefully measured amount of compressed air. In the torpedo room, technicians removed the warheads from 4 Mark 14 torpedoes, replacing them with bundles of clothing, personal effects, and anything else that would float. And in the engine room, Chief Washington opened a valve that he had prayed he would never need to use, the emergency diesel fuel dump. At exactly 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes before dawn, the Barracuda rose from its hiding place against the cliff, but instead of surfacing, it climbed only to 150 feet. Then, in a carefully choreographed sequence, it released its deception. First, the garbage bags, timed to reach the surface just as the first light of dawn made them visible. Then, the modified torpedoes, set to run straight up and scatter their contents across a wide area. Finally, 200 gallons of diesel fuel, creating a spreading slick that would look exactly like a submarine's death wound. From the bridge of the lead destroyer, Hagekaze, Commander Ichiro Yamamoto watched the debris rise to the surface. He had been hunting the American submarine for nearly 12 hours. His crew was exhausted. His fuel was running low. And now, finally, the evidence he had been waiting for. Oil spreading across the water. Clothing and debris bobbing in the swells, the unmistakable signs of a kill. He picked up his radio and reported to Fleet Command, "American submarine destroyed. Position 24 by degree 42N, 120 degree 80E, proceeding to base." The 4 destroyers turned and headed west, leaving the debris field behind. 70 feet below the surface, the USS Barracuda lay motionless, waiting. Commander Caldwell watched the sonar display as the destroyer's propeller signatures faded into the distance. He counted to 1,000. Then counted again. At 6:15 a.m., he gave the order. "Surface the boat. Begin emergency ventilation. And somebody get that goddamn torpedo room pumped out before we sink for real." The Barracuda broke the surface into the golden light of a Pacific dawn. Men poured out of the hatches, gasping the fresh air, collapsing on the deck in exhaustion and relief. They had survived. But here's the part that transforms this story from a remarkable survival tale into something far more significant. Remember Radioman Martinez and his modified transmitter? The signals he had been sending to the USS Salmon, hoping against hope that another American submarine might still be alive somewhere in the Formosa Strait. At 6:47 a.m., as the Barracuda limped east on diesel power, Martinez received a reply. 3 words in Morse code, so faint that he had to press his headphones tight against his ears to hear them. Salmon still alive. The USS Salmon had survived the attack that supposedly killed her. She had been lying on the bottom at 300 feet for nearly 4 days, her crew rationing air and water, waiting for the Japanese patrols to disperse. And now, thanks to Martinez's impossible transmission, she knew she wasn't alone. Commander Caldwell faced an impossible choice. His submarine was barely functional. His crew was exhausted. They had enough fuel to reach friendly waters, but only if they left immediately. But 47 American sailors were trapped on the bottom of the Formosa Strait. He didn't hesitate. "Come about," he ordered. We're going to get our people. The rescue operation that followed would become one of the most daring in submarine warfare history. The Barracuda located the salmon by following Martinez's radio triangulation, a technique that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. They found her in 280 feet of water, resting on a sandy ledge, her crew barely conscious from oxygen deprivation. What happened next required ingenuity that no naval manual had ever contemplated. The salmon couldn't surface. Her ballast systems had been destroyed by depth charges, but she could rise to periscope depth if she could get enough compressed air into her emergency tanks. The Barracuda carried spare air flasks for her own emergency systems. If they could transfer that air to the salmon, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the Barracuda's executive officer, volunteered to dive. In 1944, deep-sea diving from a submarine was almost unheard of. The equipment was primitive. The risks were enormous. The pressure at 100 feet, the depth Hayes would need to reach, could cause nitrogen narcosis, a condition that impaired judgment and often led to fatal mistakes. Hayes went anyway. Wearing a Momsen lung, a simple rebreather device designed for submarine escape, he descended from the Barracuda's hatch with a coiled air hose trailing behind him. The water was cold, dark, and filled with the debris of the battle that had nearly killed both submarines. He found the salmon listing slightly to port, her hull scarred with the marks of near misses. Through the murky water, he could see faces pressed against the conning tower ports, men who had given up hope, now watching salvation descend toward them. It took Hayes 47 minutes to connect the air hose to the salmon's emergency manifold. He worked in near total darkness, his hands numb from the cold, his mind growing foggy from the depth. 3 times he lost his grip on the coupling and had to start over, but on the 4th attempt, it locked into place. Air began flowing from the Barracuda to the salmon. Slowly, the trapped submarine began to rise. At 2:34 p.m., the USS Salmon broke the surface for the first time in 4 days. Her crew poured onto the deck, some weeping, some praying, all of them alive. The 2 submarines limped home together, arriving at Pearl Harbor on December 3, 1944. The official Navy report credited Commander Caldwell with saving 47 lives from the salmon and 73 from his own boat. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. But Caldwell always insisted that the real heroes were his crew. Sonar operator William Chen, whose ears had detected the invisible trap and whose instincts had helped them hide within it. Radio man Danny Martinez, whose impossible transmissions had found a sister ship and given hope to men who had none. Chief of the boat Samuel Washington, who had kept the submarine running through conditions that should have killed them all. And Lieutenant Commander Peter Hayes, who had descended into the black water of the Formosa Strait and refused to come up until every last sailor was saved. After the war, Commander Caldwell was asked what he had been thinking when he gave the order to surface, the order that made his crew go pale. "I was thinking," he said, "that there are worse things than dying, and one of them is living with the knowledge that you didn't try." The USS Barracuda continued in service until 1946, when she was decommissioned as part of the post-war fleet reduction. She was sunk as a target in weapons tests off the coast of California in 1948. But her story lived on in the memories of the men who served aboard her, men who learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. Men who discovered that in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, the human spirit can find a way. And men who understood that sometimes the most dangerous order a captain can give is also the only one that leads to survival. The Formosa Strait is quiet now. The war that once made it one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth ended nearly 80 years ago. Fishermen work these waters today, unaware of the dramas that unfolded beneath them. But if you listen carefully, if you sit quietly on a boat in the early morning hours when the sea is still, you might hear something. A faint ping echoing off the underwater cliffs. The ghosts of men who hunted and were hunted. And perhaps, just perhaps, the distant rumble of propellers from submarines that refuse to surrender to the depths. Because some battles never truly end, and some crews never really leave their boats. This is the story of the USS Barracuda, a submarine that became a tomb and then refused to die. A captain who gave an order that made his crew go pale, and 73 men who discovered that the only way out is through. But here's what the official records don't tell you. 18 months after the Formosa Strait incident, Commander Thomas Caldwell retired from the Navy. He returned to his hometown of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where his family had fished the Atlantic for 4 generations. He bought a small boat, a 32-foot trawler named Sarah Jane after his late mother, and spent the rest of his days pulling lobster traps from the cold waters off Cape Ann. People in Gloucester knew he'd commanded submarines in the war. They knew he had medals, though he never wore them or talked about them. What they didn't know was that every night, without fail, he would walk down to the harbor and sit on the dock, staring at the water until midnight. His wife Margaret understood. She had learned not to wake him when the nightmares came, the ones where the depth charges never stopped falling, where the hull finally cracked, where he watched his men drown one by one in the flooding compartments. But there were good memories too. Letters from the men of the Barracuda and the Salmon arrived regularly for decades, birth announcements, wedding invitations, photographs of grandchildren who would never have existed if Caldwell had made a different choice that November morning. William Chen became a teacher in San Francisco. eventually becoming the first Chinese-American principal of Galileo High School. He never told his students about the war, but he kept a small model submarine on his desk. When curious students asked about it, he would just smile and say, "It reminds me of some old friends." Danny Martinez used his radio expertise to help build one of the first television stations in Texas. He invented a broadcast system that was used throughout the Southwest for decades. On his wall, framed in glass, was a single piece of paper, the Morse code transmission he had sent to the Salmon. 3 words: "Are you alive?" Chief Samuel Washington stayed in the Navy until 1952, retiring as a Master Chief Petty Officer, the highest enlisted rank possible. He had served on submarines for 33 years, through 2 world wars and countless patrols. When asked what he was most proud of, he never mentioned medals or commendations. He always said the same thing: "Every man I trained made it home." And Lieutenant Commander Peter Hayes, the man who had dived into the darkness to save the Salmon's crew, went on to become an admiral. He commanded submarine forces during the early Cold War, helping to design the nuclear submarines that would become America's most powerful deterrent. But he never forgot the moment he descended from the Barracuda's hatch with nothing but a Momsen lung and a prayer. "Fear is a useful thing," he wrote in his memoirs years later. "It tells you that something matters. The men on the Salmon mattered. My shipmates on the Barracuda mattered. I was terrified going down that ladder, but I was more afraid of living with myself if I didn't try." The last reunion of the Barracuda's crew was held in 1994, 50 years after their ordeal in the Formosa Strait. 11 men attended, all that remained of the original 73. Commander Caldwell was there, wheelchair-bound at 91, but still sharp as a tack. He gave a brief speech, thanking his men for their service, their courage, and their friendship. Then he said something that no one expected. "I've been keeping a secret for 50 years, he told them. "And I think it's time you knew." The room fell silent. "That night when I gave the order to surface, when I told you we were going to fight our way out, I want you to know something. I wasn't brave, I was terrified. I had no idea if we would survive. All I knew was that dying on our feet was better than dying on our knees." He paused, gathering himself. "But here's what I learned. Courage isn't something you have. It's something you find when you need it. And I found it in every single one of you. Your trust made me brave. Your faith made me strong. If I gave an order that made you go pale, it's because you gave me the courage to give it." The old men wept. Warriors who had faced death without flinching, reduced to tears by the words of their commander. Thomas Caldwell died 3 months later in his sleep, with his wife of 62 years beside him. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, a remarkable number for a quiet lobsterman from Gloucester. Among them were admirals and senators, historians and journalists, but the majority were ordinary people. The children and grandchildren of submarine sailors who had survived because of decisions made in the dark waters of the Formosa Strait. His headstone in the Gloucester Cemetery is simple. It bears his name, his dates, and a single phrase that he chose himself: "Every man came home." For the families of the Barracuda and the Salmon, those words mean everything. For a generation of submarine sailors who served after them, those words became a standard to aspire to. And for all of us who hear this story today, those words carry a simple but profound truth. Leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It's about caring so deeply for the people in your charge that you're willing to risk everything to bring them home. And it's about understanding that sometimes the most courageous order you can give is the one that makes everyone go pale, because it's the only order that gives them a chance. The Formosa Strait is quiet now. The destroyers that hunted there are long gone. The submarines that hid there have become memorials and museums and memories. But the lessons of that November night in 1944 remain. In crisis, stay calm. When all options seem bad, create a new one. Trust your people and give them reason to trust you, and never, ever give up. Because even when you're trapped at the bottom of the ocean, with the enemy above and death all around, there is always something you can do. There's always a way forward, and there's always hope, if you're brave enough to reach for it. This is the story of the USS Barracuda, a captain who gave an order that made his crew go pale, and 73 men who refused to die. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you the way it moved me, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories matter. These men matter, and their courage deserves to be remembered. Until next time, historical note. The USS Barracuda story presented here is a dramatized composite based on numerous real incidents from World War II submarine warfare. While specific names and events have been created for narrative purposes, the tactics, technology, conditions, and challenges depicted accurately reflect the experiences of American submarine crews in the Pacific theater. The depth charge attacks, silent running procedures, thermal layer tactics, air conservation challenges, and rescue operations all have documented parallels in official naval records. The Japanese Sanshiki pattern attacks, Momsen lung rescue dives, and debris deception operations were all tactics used during the war. The spirit of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood portrayed represents the true legacy of the United States submarine service